If you look at the shipping on the lakes, we think about the development of the United States historically, people don't always realize it, but it really helped to build the country as we know it today.
It was this huge trade network. Rivers and lakes didn't separate us, they brought us together. All 5 Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River and St. Lawrence Seaway were the first international superhighway.
The St. Lawrence Seaway today stands recognized as one of the most vital and useful of man-made waterways. A two-way course between the Atlantic Ocean and North America's 5 Great Lakes.
If you look at the Great Lakes, we're talking about 20% of the freshwater surface area on the globe.
If you were to take the economy of the Great Lakes region and St. Lawrence Seaway, you would have the 3rd largest GDP in the world.
That says something about the nature of Great Lakes shipping between the 1950s and the 1970s, how profitable it was.
Think of it as the bloodstream of the American manufacturing economy.
The boats that carry the 3 cargoes, the 3 cargoes that make steel possible, taconite or iron ore, limestone, and coking coal. That's what makes steel.
They would pick it up in Superior or Duluth in the northern Iron Range of Minnesota, and they would sail across Lake Superior, get down into the lower Great Lakes, and drop their load off in Detroit or in Toledo or in Cleveland.
And the only way for those bulk cargoes to get from their mines to those mills is through the Soo Locks and on ships. Ships are the cheapest way to carry bulk goods like that. A single 1,000-footer that's operating today can carry the equivalent of 3,000 semi-trucks in a single load, or 700 rail cars in a single load.
Imagine trying to ship all that stuff by, the roads would be destroyed. And when you do it by rail, people get tired of the roads being blocked time and time again.
Perhaps you can put taconite ore in an airplane, but it would be a very heavy airplane. You've got to sail it.
And because it can be carried in a cost-effective manner, keeps the price of steel low. The price of steel is dependent on, in part, the cost of shipping. And when you can do it efficiently and effectively and cost-effectively, it makes the steel industry possible.
This was something that families depended on, the jobs, and not just in shipping, but also all the way down the line. Car plants, machine shops.
Agriculture and mining and manufacturing, it's a tremendous amount of commerce that's happening on the Great Lakes.
You go out and any road you drive on, every steel girder that you see and every car that you drive has a connection to Great Lakes shipping.
If the Soo Locks closes, by the way, our economy will go down the tubes in about 6 months. The entire national economy. That's how important shipping is to everybody.
The Fitzgerald literally and figuratively carried the U.S. economy. And so manufacturing then, just like manufacturing today, is a big part of the U.S. economy.
It may not be the most glamorous industry, but it is absolutely the most essential industry. It's our economic and manufacturing bloodstream.
Boats like these made money for their owners and their investors. So much so that the Fitzgerald was owned by a life insurance company.
Northwestern Mutual paid for the design, the construction. They owned that ship. It was about $10 million at the time then, so that would have been about $25 or $30 million in today's dollars. That's a major investment. But Ogilvy Norton did not design and construct the Fitzgerald. They were simply running it.
When the Great Lakes Engineering Works were building and putting together the keel and also all of the structure of the Edmund Fitzgerald, she was 729 feet long. It made a big difference in some of the ships that are in the 500.
One of the first ships to do modular construction. They had 3 sections of the ship, which they shipped into Detroit.
The big area difference between boats built in 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940 compared to 1958 is the Fitzgerald has welded steel plates.
It still had rivets, but welding is cheaper and faster and lighter. These things, of course, save you money, including 1.2 million pounds. Once it's finished, you can go faster that way, carry more on it.
People have often questioned whether or not welding contributed to the loss of the Fitzgerald. The question of whether one methodology is fundamentally better than the other one. Technology affects everything, and every industry has those kind of changes.
The launch was a little chaotic. The traditional champagne bottle that is broken over the ship broke on the third try.
There were about 10,000 people, along with the party of Mr. Fitzgerald and all of the top brass of Columbia and also of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. Well, the Edmund Fitzgerald itself was side launch, meaning she had ropes that were tied to her starboard side, and then there were blocks that were on the dock that were punched out by all the workers. It was a very, very memorable moment for the Fitzgerald family. That being said, it took over half an hour after Mrs. Fitzgerald broke the champagne bottle.
It was difficult to just get it launched because I think it was so big. It actually flooded or drenched many in the crowd. A man had a heart attack and passed away. Maybe it came back to haunt the Fitzgerald 17 years later in November 1975.
When it was launched, it was the largest object dropped into fresh water. That's a headline from one of the Detroit newspapers in 1958. This massive ship, record-breaking ship, it was faster than many of its contemporaries.
The Fitzgerald was essentially the top of the line. It was the queen of their fleet.
The Edmund Fitzgerald represented the sort of zenith at the time of Great Lakes ship engineering.
It was also the biggest and could carry the most, and that was the whole point. Northwestern Mutual, Edmund Fitzgerald himself, he wanted to make the greatest ship in the Great Lakes, and they did without question.
People from town and people from all over the region would come here to watch her when she would pass through the Sulaks. A couple of the captains would make it kind of a festive occasion. They would play music over the PA to entertain the crowds that were in the platform. The crew would talk to the visitors, and she was just a huge fan favorite.
The Fitz was one of more than 270 vessels carrying ore in those days. There was a lot of demand for steel, so the ore demand was peaking. And the result was that the Fitz came out and she was just another truck in the line. She was a good-looking truck, but she was another truck in the line. And so she did her job to carry her 26,000 tons up and down every season.
She launched in 1958, and she had the largest single load carried through the locks that year. In 1960, she would become the first ship ever in Sulak's history to carry over 1 million tons in a single season.
A ship that was constantly overloaded. You know, the owners of that ship basically knocked the hell out of it and worked the hell out of it.
In 1968, she set a brand new record for the most cargo carried through. She carried over 30,000 tons in a single load,
as opposed to the maximum 26,000 long tons. So there were clear cases where season after season, they were running that ship hard, they were filling it up beyond capacity, and they were trying to get just one more trip in and pushing well into November, where the weather and the waves are just completely unforgiving on the Great Lakes, especially on Lake Superior.
These are working ships. These are not cruise ships. These are not luxury ships. And so they slam the hell out of these ships. They work the hell out of these ships, and they work the hell out of the people on them.
The Fitzgerald represented a type of life and a type of boat that sailed in the second half of the 20th century. In many ways typical of what thousands of other sailors experienced on the Great Lakes in the sense of its everyday life.
You haven't worked hard until you've been in a paper mill, until you've been on a road crew building roads, until you've been on a ship on the Great Lakes.
Everyone knows the farmer, we know the factory worker, we know the miner. No one knows the sailor. That's where all your stuff comes from. Why don't we know these guys? Because they're on a ship 9 months out of the year. Even if they're next door neighbor, you don't know them.
In that sense, they were heroic because they are working behind the scenes to keep the American economy going.
Back in the 1970s, the industry had over 1,000 sailors working, and so people's paychecks provided families with income that allowed them to purchase things at stores and celebrate holidays and put your kids through college. That was a common thing going back 75, 100 years, is that if you wanted to go to college, what a great way to pay for it was one season on a boat could pay for 4 years of college in 1920.
Life aboard ship is very routine. They have jobs that they do every day, and it doesn't matter if it's day or night. It doesn't matter if they're in dock or if they're out on the lake. they have jobs to do.
These are very specialized jobs, and if you've ever seen an oiler oiling a quadruple expansion steam engine, you didn't want to lose those guys because it was an art to be able to achieve that.
These guys read a ton of books. The librarian at Soo Locks would come down with a cart of books once a week when your ship came in, and you would check books out from the Sault Ste. Marie Library, and you check them back in, and you go through again a week later.
You are gone 8 or 9 months of the year. You're out on the Great Lakes and you're not at home. So the time that you have with your loved one here is especially precious.
This, of course, was a time well before cell phones. It was very difficult to get mail. They could only call their loved ones when they were at port, so that's maybe once or twice a week.
And when you get back to shore at Silver Bay or Superior, Wisconsin, or Toledo, Ohio, you call up right away from the payphone there on the dock, and you find out that little Ricky just learned how to ride a bike, and you had nothing to do with it.
They do miss their kinfolk at home, and they miss out on things like ball games and things you would normally do with your kids.
You know, the old saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder. When people got off the boat in December, it was a homecoming.
Their kids don't see them but for 3 months out of the year. It's a brutal lifestyle in many ways. But most of these guys grew up in the Great Depression. A lot of these guys served in World War II or in Korea. And you know what? They were not complaining about the deal they got.
Those were some of the very best jobs available. And this was, for many of those families, it was the only source of income.
They had great jobs, great union pay, they made good money. They got fed like kings, the food was spectacular. And it was a lot more interesting than probably working in a factory, or working on a farm, or working in a mine.
It's hard work, depending on what your job is. The captain's job may have little physical manual labor to it, but he's also in charge, and he is responsible for everything. That's heavy work in my book.
Captains are usually pretty laid back. They're very serious about what they're doing and about their vessel, but they're not Captain Bligh.
The guys that became captains and first mates in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, they tended to be what some people refer to as heavy weather Harrys. They sailed through every storm.
The kind of attitude that you needed to have to go out there on Lake Superior in these dangerous waters time and time again and get the job done. He sounded like Ernest McSorley did, that he was the kind of man who got the job done. Tough, no-nonsense kind of guy who you would associate with a ship like the Edmund Fitzgerald.
McSorley is fascinating to me. He was, without question, the best captain on the Great Lakes. This guy could parallel park a 729-foot iron ore carrier with 5 feet on either side, with a ship on either side, like you're backing up your pickup truck. This guy was that good. And also the best captain to work for. The crew loved that guy.
His very first boat was a little one-of-a-kind steamer called the Carleton, and he sailed her for 1 year. And that was his first command, and then he went on to the William Stiffel, and that was his second command. So they were both small vessels, and then he worked his way up the chain to larger and larger vessels.
A very self-effacing guy that could tell jokes and knew what it meant to be human. He had a wife who was ill. She lived here in Toledo. One of the reasons he was happy to get the Fitzgerald assignment was because he could move his wife to Toledo. One of the many nicknames of the Fitzgerald is the Toledo Express, because it had a regular run to Toledo. That's why a lot of the crew was from Northwest Ohio, because they knew the boat was going to be here for a day and a half unloading and getting supplies. They could go home and visit family.
And why did they do the last trip? For his bonus. Why? To pay for his wife's medical care, Nellie, in Toledo. She needed more help. This is one more trip to get his bonus, to pay for her medical care, and she's waiting for him on the dock to finish.
People hear the word lake and they think of a more placid and pristine lake. Lake Superior is not that kind of lake. It is an angry, turbulent body of water with high waves and high winds.
There are 44 wrecks that took place throughout history on November 10th. It's kind of an indicator that there is something in meteorology that is going on that tends to happen in that time frame of early November.
So why? Because the water is always a month or two behind the air as far as the temperature goes. So in the summertime, everyone knows, in May and June, Great Lakes are still cold even when it's warm outside. That's fine. In the fall, it's not fine.
kind of in a position to where it gets unique weather circumstances, where you get warm weather from the south, from the Gulf region, pushing up and then meeting colder weather coming from the north. This can create intense low pressure systems over the lake, which in turn create gale force storms.
When you boil water at home, what happens? Right? It starts bubbling up. Why? It starts escaping. Right? The warm water wants to join the cold air. The steam starts coming up. Those are the waves.
And that creates a really unstable environment that can really whip up storms into something monstrous.
The winds are stronger, the waves are larger, and on Lake Superior, waves come in a different way than they do on the Atlantic Ocean. The waves on the Atlantic are much more regular and spaced apart, and they're almost in a rhythm. So you get a slam, and then there's a pause, and a pause, then a slam, another pause. Lake Superior, they have what are known as rogue waves, meaning they're out of order and they're out of rhythm, and they can actually slam you out of nowhere, 1, 2, 3, right in a row.
Let's say a ship in 1889, or even 1892, or 1905, or even 1975 could go out into that lake and suddenly find themselves in a position that they may not want to be in.
And a lot of that can happen very suddenly. It's not like the Atlantic coast where you can see a hurricane coming from literally thousands of miles away.
The Great Lakes actually are as dangerous or more dangerous than the oceans. And that's for a few reasons. One, salt water weighs down the waves in the ocean. So instead of high and pointy, they're like roller coasters. The Great Lakes, they're like mountain ranges. They're high and pointy. You can get a 700-foot freighter with the bow in one end, 30 feet high, the stern and the other end, 30 feet high, with nothing in the middle, except 26,000 tons of iron. That's gonna crack it, all right? That's the kind of things that can happen on the Great Lakes, and most of us have no sense of how crazy these lakes really are.
Unless you are on the lakes, on these ships in November, you have no appreciation for the risk that these men are taking.
That's what's going on Lake Superior in November. That's why the sailors get hazard pay.
You have Thanksgiving dinner coming up, you have Christmas and presents, and so that's the reason why they stay on the lakes and they push themselves. But also, let's be clear, there is a clear financial advantage. There is a major incentive for those companies to keep pushing their fleet. A great part of the American economy depends on whether or not they are able to haul taconite ore from Minnesota down to Ohio and Kentucky, whether they can do that or not.
But the crew of the Fitzgerald would have lived through very stormy situations before. In particular, Captain McSorley was pretty well known as being a rough weather captain.
Fitzgerald left Superior, Wisconsin on November the 9th, 1975. It was in lovely, unseasonably warm weather, which isn't always the case in November.
The later winter comes, the angrier it arrives. It's like a gigantic dam, and when that finally breaks, it's going to get ugly.
The National Weather Service issues a gale warning. They've been tracking the storm system that's been moving across the Rockies, across Kansas, and up in the Lake Superior.
So that system had happened before, but there was a confluence of both a warm front and a cold front coming down from Canada.
If one of these freighters backed away from every predicted storm, they'd never carry anything. They'd never go out there. McSorley would always say, you know, we don't make any money sitting in port.
And so early on, he had a sense that this was going to be a rough storm. However, it was not unusual to have a major storm like this coming through.
With that in mind, McSorley, captain of the Edmund Fitzgerald, met up with the Arthur M. Anderson, which was coming out with taconite also.
They decided because of that storm, they were going to take a northern route that would use the Canadian shoreline. Hopefully their ships wouldn't get beat up so much on the way, which is exactly what they did.
So as the Fitzgerald gets to the eastern part of Lake Superior, they're in communication with the Arthur M. Anderson, and they're sort of riding out the storm together. At some point, there's a snow squall that really impedes visibility.
And the waves at this point here were estimated to be between 30 to 40 to 50 feet. The wind itself was then also a main factor creating then all of the tempest. That being said, it was one that the Fitz and the Anderson were not taking any chances at this point here. They were seasoned sailors.
Is it just another big storm to them? Yes, it is. And when they're done with it, it gives them something really great to talk about.
The Arthur Anderson is following the Fitzgerald anywhere from 17 miles down to 10 miles throughout the course. They're in communication with each other. The communication between both boats is important to explain potential reasons for the loss of the vessel, because things that were said are really the only evidence that we have of what was going on board the Fitzgerald in the hours preceding her sinking.
The Fitz was running just fine. His only problem was he only had one radar going, because his backup radar had been taken out by a crane operator by accident. So he was down to one radar, and then the storm took that radar out. So now he's kind of flying blind. Then the only way he's got to give his position is through the radio direction finder. Well, normally that would do great. You can trace that step by step. It's a very easy instrument to use. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard had been budget cut. So they're going around automating stations. And they were told many times, do not automate Whitefish Point. It's too important. Oh, we've got backup generators, so that's no problem. Whitefish Point was knocked out of service by the storm.
You know, the Whitefish Point Lighthouse wasn't operating that night. That's not really a good thing. I don't think it impacted one way or the other what happened to the Fitzgerald.
The Fitzgerald loses its radar at a certain point and eventually relies on the Anderson to help guide them through the storm.
The Arthur Anderson is able to sort of say, here's where you're heading, this is the direction you're in. Navigation by a compass is not within 10 feet of your actual location. It could be several miles off.
Both the Captain McSorley of the Fitzgerald and Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson, they kind of went in tandem downbound, crossing the lake. They had been through a lot of storms. So they knew eventually they needed to probably alter course.
Once they make the turn to go to Whitefish Bay, really the only event or place along that trail, so to speak, is Caribou Island and the shoals around it. The question becomes, how close to that shoal did the Fitzgerald come?
So Caribou Island had been featured as having a 6-fathom shoal.
A fathom is 6 feet, and therefore 6 fathom shoal is 36 feet. And this thing drafts 29 feet already, so if it came anywhere near there, and it probably did, if it hit there, it probably did damage. If it got damaged, then water's coming in. And water's coming in, now you have a list.
Even Captain Cooper pretty much interjected with the U.S. Coast Guard on the radio that the Fitz was going too close, much closer than he himself would want to be.
Bernie Cooper and his first and second mate in the Anderson pilot house. He was convinced that the ship ran aground and that it was taken on water and listing.
You don't slam onto the bottom in heavy seas without not feeling it. Why don't you report that?
You know, there's always a dad who is not going to consult the map, who's certainly not going to stop at the gas station to ask for directions. There was a similar mentality for captains on the Great Lakes, that no one else was going to tell them how to sail the ship.
Ernest McSorley knew this lake, okay, and he was no way reckless or careless. There's only one problem. The chart that he had in his pilot house, the latest sounding for that shoal had been done in 1918. Think about it, this is 1975. And the Canadian government had taken that heavy traffic area and hadn't surveyed it since the First World War.
We know from at least the point of passing Caribou, the Fitzgerald began to have troubles.
15 minutes after he passed that shoal, he had a fence down, he had a list, and he was taking on water. 15 minutes. That amount of taconite could absorb about 12,000 tons of water before it even showed.
Maybe the taconite shifted, all right, but now you got a real problem that's getting worse over time.
And she had her pumps going, and 2 vents from the ballast tanks were broken. And also, there was an inspection that was done in October of 75 that determined that the coaming on the hatch cover, 6 of them, had to be repaired and replaced.
Now, one thing that is leading is the statement that Captain McSorley made, that these were the biggest waves he'd ever seen. Yet Captain Cooper said, well, the waves were big, but they weren't the biggest I've ever seen. Why did they appear bigger to this well-experienced master, Ernest McSorley? I think it's because he was sinking. And if you're sinking, the waves look bigger.
The list is tilting hard to starboard, basically. That means you have something serious going wrong with your ship. So he might not have been panicking, but he knew he's in for the fight of his life.
I don't think he knew what was going on. I don't think anybody knew exactly what was happening. We don't know to this day exactly what was happening.
Fitzgerald, at this point, we know some things had happened through those radio communications between the Anderson and between the Fitzgerald, that Fitzgerald had lost radar, a couple of vents were damaged and a little bit of water was getting in. Fence rail was down as well.
Jesse Cooper made this point when he said, you don't lose a fence when you do that. You lose a fence when you hog, okay? Because these are wire cables that run through wire stakes that are on the side of the boat. When those snap, you've got a real big problem. It happens when you hog. He hogged the boat. And after he hogged the boat, he had water coming in, both of his pumps are running, and they're not doing any good.
She was getting close to Whitefish Bay. Whitefish Bay would have provided protection from wave action to allow the crew a chance to get off. Whereas in the open waters of Lake Superior, in that type of storm, putting one of those lifeboats down is a death sentence. And jumping into the water without survival suits was a death sentence. There was one thing that was said between the Fitzgerald and the Arthur Anderson by McSorley and his crew, which was, we are checking down. They're slowing their speed. Why are they slowing their speed? If you know Whitefish Bay is going to provide some modicum of safety, why slow your speed? To let the Arthur Anderson catch up. If they can close the gap, if anybody gets out and is in the water, maybe the Anderson could have saved them.
The Arthur M. Anderson was about 10 to 12 miles behind. Then what happened at this point here, large waves, and I'm talking about waves that are anywhere from 40 to 50 feet, crashed onto the Arthur M. Anderson. They are the sisters. They damaged, those waves, the lifeboats off the Arthur M. Anderson. As they kept rolling southward, then they hit the Edmund Fitzgerald.
So this ship, which is already low in the water, then gets slammed by the Three Sisters waves. 1, 2, 3. It's like a heavyweight fighter getting hit in the face, hit in the jaw. 1, 2, 3. Late in the fight, when you're already exhausted.
The last communication that the Fitzgerald had with the Anderson was Captain McSorley saying that they were holding their own.
And those were the last words that were ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Those words have almost gone down in history.
You can't read between the lines, you couldn't see facial expressions, but it comes down to this question. Was he aware? Did he have situational awareness of what was happening?
I don't even think the crew of the Fitzgerald or any of the crews that were out on the lake that night underestimated the storm.
A veteran sailor like McSorley, who had plied the Great Lakes for a long, long time, I don't think much would have thrown him.
I tend to think that the captain, the first mate, the pilot house crew was experienced enough to know that with a list, a fence rail down, vent covers lost, they knew they had a problem.
What are you going to do? And you're just going to keep going. So he just kept plugging along, hoping for the best. And that's what got him, was that it was circumstances. And they were not necessarily all his.
I don't think he fully realized, and the crew fully realized, the magnitude of this and the danger that they were in until the very end.
The fact that Captain McSorley, considered the best captain on the Great Lakes, he never got an SOS out. A guy like that would never fail to do so. failed to get his men in the lifeboats, get the life jackets on and so on. If he had any thought that they're going down, those things would have been done.
As the Fitzgerald approaches what would end up being its final resting place in Lake Superior, it disappears off the radar of the Anderson.
You can see her lights up ahead, and then a snow squall comes through. Snow squall disappears, the lights suddenly they can't see anymore, they can't pick up the Fitzgerald on their radar. I don't know that anybody at that moment conceived that the Fitzgerald had actually gone to the bottom. Captain Cooper got just that concerned enough that he started calling the Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie, expressing his concern of what was happening out there and what might have happened.
I asked him how he was making out with his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that. But it looks from the information that we have that it's very certain that the Fitzgerald went down. And we're talking now about a matter of life and death and looking for survivors that might be in life rafts or in the water.
In the case of the Fitzgerald, there's a lot of big question mark over that, right? Since they didn't send a distress call, they didn't pass last known position until hours before. That's definitely the biggest kind of challenge in a case like that, is not even knowing where we start for it. You're gonna have a huge search area from the get-go, which is just going to provide that great challenge in terms of trying to get a successful outcome.
The Coast Guard did not have any vessel at Sault Ste. Marie that could come out into those weather conditions. The nearest vessel that could do that was at Duluth in the dock with one engine being repaired. So it was a full day's sailing time away. There was nothing they could send out there to help these guys.
The U.S. Coast Guard requested that any of the ships that were anchored in Whitefish Bay, and even for the Arthur M. Anderson, to turn around in the storm and to go and search to see if there were any survivors.
And they're all trying to find one raft with 2 or 3 guys on it, still hanging out for dear life, freezing. And the only thing that keeps those guys going, the idea that somewhere, somehow, some other ship was gonna risk their lives to save your life. You don't get that in a factory or farm. You get that in the Great Lakes.
That had to have been a terribly difficult decision for Captain Cooper. They decided to head back out into that storm, and a couple other ships, the William Clay Ford.
Somebody had to go out there, and so we figure it's our turn to go out there. We go out there and look for them.
How bad was it out there?
Well, when the sea starts coming over the pilot house, you know that you got a pretty big sea.
The pilot house is 50 feet high.
It's at least 50 feet high on that ship, sure.
And one of them, William Clay Ford, was running light. She had no cargo, okay? A big vessel like that, in those big waves running light, that's how they break in half, okay? And they still went out and searched. And Jesse Cooper went back out and searched. That was heroic. It really, really was.
You knew he had to go, not because you're gonna find the ship. You might find a raft with a few guys in it. You're doing it because it's the sailor's code, because that's what you're supposed to do.
Then the questions really start to percolate. Well, what happened? This is where a lot of the theories come in. Interestingly enough, with a lot of these expeditions that have gone down to the Fitzgerald wreck site, often those have come back with more questions than answers. Even Jacques Cousteau and the Calypso coming up into the Great Lakes to put their submersible down on the Fitzgerald itself. They came away with the idea that, well, that Fitzgerald had to break apart on the surface. That was their theory.
If you look at all of the vessels that broke in half on the surface in the Great Lakes that are steel vessels, none of them were loaded with cargo. Iron ore is very dense, and what it does is it stiffens the hull. Every single one of those that broke in half was not loaded with iron ore. They were running light. The Fitz was fully loaded. So whatever happened to the Fitz happened quickly.
There's a theory that the Fitzgerald grounded slightly on a shoal.
And that was the difference between what happened with the Anderson and what happened with the Fitzgerald. The Anderson did not run aground, the Fitzgerald did.
Probably a combination of factors that contributed to the Fitzgerald sinking. The one thing that's for sure is that it lost buoyancy somehow. Water was getting in.
Almost everyone agrees that when it finally happened, it happened fast. This boat goes about 16 miles an hour, all right? It hit the bottom around 35 miles an hour.
If they took a large wave and nosedived into it, as Captain Cooper suspected, it would be 1, 2, 3, and she'd be down. 530
feet of Lake Superior is very, very deep. But this ship is so big, it's 729 feet long. So about 200 feet are sticking out of the water when it actually hits the bottom.
And the engine and the weight of all the taconite then crumple the section of the middle of the Fitzgerald from hatch cover number 9 to 17.
And remember, physics are involved here. If you have a huge mass, it only takes a little bit of acceleration to get an extreme force. And that's why you see wreckage that is bent like it's made out of clay.
Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson, I think he was concerned that the Fitzgerald took a nosedive, that perhaps she had been losing buoyancy and she had been taking on just enough water that those 3 big waves hit her and she just wasn't able to recover. That's certainly a possibility. That sounds logical, but in the end, we don't really know.
This was a bad storm, but there were several vessels that are the same size and the same basic configuration as the Edmund Fitzgerald that sailed right through the storm and didn't take a lick.
The tragedy of the Edmund Fitzgerald goes well beyond the theories of what happened that day on November 10th, whether it was the rogue wave, whether it was the hatches, whether it was running aground. I believe the reason why the Fitzgerald sunk is because of corporate neglect, a lack of proper government oversight, and deferred maintenance. That is the reason why the Fitzgerald sunk. The SS Sylvania, 2 years before the Fitz went down, its propeller fell off, and the Sylvania was part of the Ogilvy Norton fleet. So that company was well aware that some of their ships were not in good condition. And yet Ogilvy Norton did not learn that lesson, and they allowed the Fitzgerald to carry forward even though it was in no condition to sail that night.
In 1969, 71, and 73, the U.S. Coast Guard and the ABS allowed the Fitzgerald and other ships to go, in their case, from about 14 feet of freeboard. That's ship out of the water, fully loaded. They knocked that down to 11 feet. That's 3 feet free. It was not designed to do what it did that night or those years. If you bend a paperclip back and forth, and back and forth and back and forth, what happens eventually? Finally, it's gonna snap. That's your ship.
The U.S. companies took pretty good care of their vessels, and the Coast Guard kept up on the inspections. I don't think you can attribute the loss of the Fitzgerald to maintenance at all. You have to put all the circumstances together, and then you're still just going to get a probable cause.
You know, most historians, of course, want definitive answers. That's why we write, that's why we research, that's why we think. But sometimes things are better left unsaid, better left unsolved. That air of mystery, that air of incompletion, that's the way life works. The sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald was a tragedy, and a personal human tragedy most of all, but it was also a tremendous embarrassment to the ship's owners, Northwestern Mutual, and the operating company Ogilvy Norton.
Ogilvy Norton never notified any of the families the loss of the vessel and their family member. They just brushed it aside. I think they were treated like bottom line, and that was it. Just draw a line through them, see you later, let's proceed on with next season. That's kind of the way it is with very large companies that deal in transportation. A lot of times, they just mark it off.
They could have paid a lot. They're making a lot of money off those guys for a long time, all right? Millions upon millions of dollars. And the settlements were random, and none of them were very much, frankly. But I just find the callousness more disturbing. The lack of communication, the lack of empathy for what they went through.
When you have employees, when you have people who are working for a company and who are not just giving their labor to you, but in this case, giving you their life, you can see and appreciate just how wrong it was for those responsible to ignore the family members, to try to settle quickly and not to take responsibility.
Are you familiar with the Mark Thomas story? Mark Thomas is a crew member of the Fitzgerald. He's lost on the Fitzgerald. His father was in-house counsel for Columbia Steamship. His father got him a job on the Fitzgerald because he wasn't sure what he wanted to do. He was out of high school and thinking about college, and the dad says, I can get you on one of the boats. You can see what it's like, and you work, make some money. And as in-house counsel, his father is also responsible for settling all the claims, including his own son. That's, hard. And you can only, so when you talk about the impact on family members, a person having to that feeling of, I put my son on the Fitzgerald and it sank, must have been an incredibly difficult time.
Edmund Fitzgerald was the last commercial ship to go down in 50 years and counting. And it's because that ship was so great, when it went down, it was so shocking, that they knew they had to have reforms. And they take pride in the fact that no one has suffered as they have since.
That sort of drove home the point that it doesn't matter how big and how new your vessel is and how unsinkable you think it is, a wind can blow that will take down one of these vessels.
That directly served to make shipping on the Great Lakes safer for all those on board. We have the Fitzgeralds in a grim way to thank for that.
These guys were heroes before it went down. That what they do for a living is very hard, often very dangerous, can be very scary. And without them, we're not living the lives we live. They're unsung heroes that most people are utterly unaware of.
Nothing can bring them back. But living in legend for all time, I think, is something pretty special.
If we skip forward to 1995, and that's the last expedition, that was the Royal Canadian Navy, Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, Sony Corporation, and National Geographic combined expedition, and that was the expedition that went down to recover the Belle.
There's been 5 expeditions to the Edmund Fitzgerald, and never once did anybody ever ask what the family members wanted. This time they came to us and requested that we would work with them to make this the last dive on the Edmund Fitzgerald.
It is in Canadian water. The Ministry of Culture was then responsible for the Ontario Heritage Act that stipulated that nobody should be close to the Edmund Fitzgerald by 500 meters.
A couple of the family members explained the significance of the bell on the Fitzgerald, that every ship had its own bell that had its own unique sound. And so in that respect, the bell was the soul of the ship. And so the effort to recover the bell was the soul, the spirit, the lasting life of the Fitzgerald. And I think that was a way to do justice to them.
We should remember the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald in terms of what they mean to America and the American economy. These are people who got up every day and went to work on dangerous jobs for their families, for their communities, and also for the United States. So let's remember them as patriots.